So hopefully during this session, we'll be able to learn again from another deaf leader who we have present with us today, who is very senior in both the deaf and hearing communities. So talking about communities, today we have a very special welcome to viewers from the USA, Australia, and Dubai. So welcome to the summit this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I would like to say a thank you to our co-hosts for the session today. And thank you to the organisers for their support. I also wanted to pass on our thanks to Sign Solutions for sponsoring our event today. So your speaker for today is somebody who I'm sure you all know well. So you might have seen him on TV. He has been working in the commercial world. He has been working for a publication and online. In terms of his career to date, I'm not going to fill you in on that because you're going to find out very more shortly. So our speaker himself has experienced and encountered issues along the way on his journey to becoming a leader. So people who've said that he wasn't able to progress because of his deafness. And today you'll find out a bit more about what happened to him when he experienced that discrimination and oppression. Our speaker is very proud to be deaf. And we will learn about how he believes that deafness has actually helped him on his journey to success throughout his career. So it's my greatest pleasure to introduce to everybody our guest speaker for today, Toby Burton. Hello, everybody. So regardless of if you're hearing or deaf, we all have one thing in common today, and that's that all of us are keen to encourage more opportunities for deaf leadership. I strongly believe that deaf people have a unique set of skills and experience that they will have gathered throughout the course of their lives to enable them to become better leaders, perhaps, than their hearing counterparts. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my own story. So there's three areas that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about my career so far. I'm also going to focus in a bit more on the challenges and problems that I encountered and how I steered my way around them to success. And also looking back on that experience, some of the lessons that I learned. So now, if I talk about my journey so far, my name's Toby, and I grew up in Belgium. I moved to England over 20 years ago. And today I'm not going to tell you my life story. I'm going to focus more on my career history, how I have worked my way with my hunger to success through my career. And I really want us to be able to take more deaf people on that journey to leadership and success with us. So throughout my career, I have worked in 3 businesses, and I've also had a voluntary role at the Royal Association for Deaf People, which is a charity. So now if I move on to my first career experience on the next slide, I joined Unilever on their graduate management scheme. I was young and hungry for success. I was aiming high and super ambitious. And I picked Unilever as a company to work for It's a huge £50 billion business that makes home care and food products. And they had a fantastic graduate scheme at the time. So I finished university and joined their graduate scheme, which involves moving among a number of different placements. So you might start in IT and then move to sales and marketing, gaining experience through all of the roles. I moved into finance and realised that was the area for me. I loved using the numbers to manage the business. So that's where I stayed. In my time at Unilever, I became a qualified accountant, but in no ways was it smooth sailing. It was a really cool business. It was very fast moving. I felt as though there were lots of barriers along my journey, and I'll fill you in on a few more of those challenges a little bit later on. I realised that probably wasn't the place for me to stay. So I thought about a move to a different company. I almost gave up, but I thought, no, I'll give it a go. And then I moved along to The Economist. And The Economist was a very different type of business, so much smaller than Unilever, but still a very well-known publication with a 1.6 million circulation on a weekly basis of their newspaper, which focuses on political and economic news. When I joined The Economist, I was shocked by how old-fashioned their finance function was. Unilever had been very modern, very ahead of the times, and The Economist wasn't like that at all. But what that did mean is that I was able to implement lots of new things that I had learned from my previous job. So the accounting was very traditional, very much about posting numbers in boxes. And I wanted to be able to work with the business and really partner with them. I ended up setting up an FP&A, which means financial planning and analysis division, which focused more on the commercial side of finance and the business. And I absolutely loved that area of finance. I worked at The Economist for 11 years and then ended up becoming the CFO for their publisher division, responsible for circulation, digital advertising and events. I had teams based in New York and London. And then I was approached by a different company who had an opportunity for me that was pretty attractive. And I ended up moving to a different business. And at that point, I moved to a company called Fastmarkets, which is owned by Euromoney PLC. It's one of the world's leading price reporting agencies, responsible for managing the prices that are provided to markets in metals and forest products and a number of different commodities. And there I'm the CFO and COO and on the board of executives, on the executive board there. I'm still working there. Fastmarkets is a hugely exciting and fast growing business, very acquisitional. So lots of acquisitions and mergers, which have provided me with a really different range of experience. I'm still working there for Fastmarkets in the city now. And in addition to my professional career, I've been working in the business, but felt a little bit detached from the deaf community. And I missed that working, in the hearing world, in business. And then an opportunity arose within the deaf community to be on the board of RAD, the Royal Association for Deaf People. I was approached and invited to be a member of the board there. So on the next slide, that shows how that was on the board of RAD. So RAD is the oldest deaf organisation, but has often been run and managed by hearing people, and deaf people tend to not have a particularly significant role in the board, be a bit more of a token. And then they would be shown papers and the deaf members of the board would vote to agree the papers, but they didn't take a particularly active role. And I disputed that should be the case. I said, this is a deaf organisation, it should be managed by deaf people. And in the 10 years I spent there on the board, I managed to transition that to become deaf chair at the end of my journey there. And I recruited more deaf people onto the board, people who were able to influence and have ideas and really change and influence the strategy of the organisation to make it genuinely deaf-led, much closer to the deaf community. I think that was a great example of how deaf people can change things and can change leadership from being hearing-led to being a genuinely deaf-led organisation. It was great to be able to help that organisation on their journey and really benefit everybody along the way. So I think that's pretty much a summary of my career so far. And now I'll move on to talk about what challenges and barriers I faced in my experience so far, because there have been tough times. for me, those challenges weren't ever negative. For me, they always posed opportunities to learn. The different challenges that I encountered along the way really built up this pool of learnings that I was able to then take with me. So just looking back, I was born profoundly deaf, and the photo here is me as a young boy. You notice the black and white nature of the photo, obviously representing just how old I am. So there's me with my really old-fashioned hearing aid with the big box I carried on my chest, and sounds were played into my ears. I was never really able to hear them. You know, I tried and tried. I couldn't hear, I couldn't understand the speech. I couldn't speak well enough myself to be understood by other people. And I thought, you know, I could try and try and try, but what really is the point? So I set those hearing aids over to one side. And pretty much from that day on, I have been a sign language user who has used interpreters in my everyday life. And then I went through my school life. I had a teacher at school one day, and I remember very vividly this memory of being in a classroom where we were talking about our careers, talking about what you wanted to be when you grew up. And there were all of these different photos. There was a carpenter and an electrician and a builder. So I flipped my way through these photos, and I saw a photo of a journalist. I was 9. I remember it very clearly. I didn't really know what a journalist did. I knew that they were something to do with the news. I saw them on the news, and that's what I wanted to do. So I put my hand up in the class, and everybody looked at me, and I said, I want to be this. I want to be a journalist. And my teacher looked at me and said, no, don't be silly. You're deaf. How would you be able to hear and talk to people? It's very fast moving. You need to talk on the phone. It's impossible. You're wasting your time dreaming about being a journalist. Just don't worry about that. Think about some sort of manual job. There's lots of manual jobs that deaf people can do. And she said, you know, you're never going to be able to do that. And on that very day, as a 9-year-old, I was absolutely furious. And I said to that teacher, with everybody looking at me, I said to her, you're wrong. I said, I disagree. I said, I can be a journalist. You watch me. I'm going to become a journalist, and I'm going to come back and show you. And the funny thing is that years and years and years later, I'm not a journalist, or I'm not yet. I haven't become a journalist. However, in my time at The Economist, they had thousands of journalists who worked at The Economist all over the world, and I was responsible for managing those journalists. So absolutely proved my teacher wrong, that deaf people can do whatever they want. You know, and that wasn't a lost opportunity. That oppression didn't stop me from getting where I wanted to get to. Which I think leads me on to this next challenge you can see up here now, which is, you know, thinking about being offered a job and arriving at a job on the first day alongside maybe a hearing counterpart. And I felt almost immediately, sometimes on my first day, I was falling behind. You know, things seemed very smooth for my hearing counterparts, much smoother than they did for me. And I realized that, you know, sometimes there were, well, for one particular example, there was a meeting in a couple of weeks' time. It was a project about something new, and they wanted everybody to get together. And if you were in that meeting, you had the opportunity to share your ideas and potentially have a promotion. But for me, I found out the date of the meeting, and I searched for interpreters, and I found an interpreter for the date of the meeting. And then that interpreter said, there needs to be 2 of us. I can't do this on my own. So I spent hours longer finding a second interpreter. I was all ready to go. And just before the meeting, the person who was organising the meeting decided that the meeting would be 2 days later or a week later. And there I go back to my hours and hours of searching for interpreters, which meant I had to spend my evenings and my weekends doing my actual day work. So I stayed at a hotel near the office because I was desperate to catch up. So I went straight to the hotel, caught up with my work I hadn't done, and very quickly reached a point of burnout. I was very stressed, and it was a very difficult time. But looking back, all of those problems that I solved along the way really built up into an asset of knowledge, just this box of knowledge that I then had available to me. All of those experiences and problems that I'd encountered, where my hearing counterparts had very smooth sailing. I was, you know, careering my way around this road that was filled with challenges and hurdles that I overcame. And of course, those problems and those challenges continued to happen throughout my career. And sometimes I felt like I'd almost had enough. There was one situation that again is very clear in my mind. So I was young, I was working at Unilever, and they'd had an initiative for a new sauce. Unilever make sauces that you can eat, and so they pulled together a project team, and I was a member of that, and we were pulling together a business case, and I was responsible for the kind of business financial projections, how much we thought we could earn from this new project when it was rolled out, how much were Asda and Tesco and Sainsbury's going to pay for this product, how much could they make. And I had to then present that project or the business case to the board for their approval to go ahead, and then the sauce would be produced and it would be sold in all of these shops. So I created this beautiful presentation. I was completely confident. I knew when the board meeting was, and I had a group of regular interpreters, and I said to them all, "Are you around?" And nobody was available for that date. It just seemed to be a particularly busy date for interpreters. So none of my regular interpreters were available. And quite near the date of the meeting, I then had to approach an agency who I didn't know to find a last minute interpreter. So up rocked 2 interpreters on the day of the presentation. I'm standing there very confident in my presentation, ready to present. I start signing, I'm completely fine. And then very quickly, I realised that the board members have got furrowed brows. They look angry. They definitely look like they're not going to approve the business plan. They look like, quite frankly, they think it's a load of rubbish. And I look at the 2 interpreters, and they're kind of whispering to each other, and they're really, really struggling. They don't understand the presentation. And of course they didn't. It was so last minute. And I just felt absolutely terrible. I felt like all of my hopes had fallen through the floor. I thought, that's it. I can't work in a business. I'm deaf. I just can't do this anymore. I'm going to have to, my teacher was absolutely right. I'm going to find myself a manual job, and just that will be it. I can't possibly do this. And for the next day or 2, it really played on my mind. I thought, I'm so unsatisfied at how the way that presentation had gone. And I pulled together an email. I sent a message to the board, and I said, please, can I repeat that presentation with my regular interpreters? And so, 2 interpreters who know me well, who I know well, and I arrived to my presentation, and everything is beautiful and smooth and lovely, just as I wanted it to be. The board were really excited. They immediately approved the business plan, and everything went perfectly smoothly. And, I had gone through all of that stress. I really should have known better to use the interpreters I didn't know. Again, that really links in with the learnings that I've taken with me. And I think that links me in with, the lessons that I have taken when I look back across my career. First of all, I think thinking about kind of role models is really important for me. So having people who are inspirational have been really important for me. And I think there are a plethora of role models within the deaf community. And when I was younger, I knew I wanted to be a leader. I had this real yearning for becoming somebody successful. And I remember Gallaudet University in the US. It's a world-renowned deaf university, and for many years, it had been in existence throughout the 19th century, but had always been run by hearing presidents who made decisions about this deaf university until 1988, when the deaf students and the deaf teachers at Gallaudet University pulled together a campaign and protests and said, which was called DPN, Deaf President Now, and they marched the streets and removed the hearing president. And for the first time ever, they had a deaf president. For me, this was the 1980s. I was very young, and it was hugely inspiring. And I thought, I can, deaf people can do this. We can make things happen and achieve the things we want to achieve. And then the second inspirational person to me is this lady here you can see in the photo, Helga Stevens, who is based in Brussels. She works at the EUD, the European Union for Deaf, and I spent a summer internship there with her. So I worked alongside her for a month, and she was tough. She was really ruthless, worked really hard, had hugely high expectations of the people who were working with her. But it was such a fantastic but harsh experience working with her. So she said that deaf people had to be better than their hearing counterparts. They always had to work really hard and to be better than the people they were working alongside. After the time I spent with her, she really proved her success. So she became an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, and then more recently has been a top 3 candidate for the EU Parliament presidency. So a very, very successful woman. 2 role models who have been, or 2 circumstances which have been hugely inspirational to me. And there are many, many more role models. I've picked a few people here. People who I have met and learnt from throughout my career within the deaf community, all of whom who have been successful in very different ways, whether it's in business or theatre or sport or medical settings. All of these have done amazingly well in their career, and there are a number of role models out there. And for me, it's been really important to recognise that these people will have also been through issues and encountered barriers and found solutions to them. Throughout my career, I've thought often about the deaf community. You know, we're very small as a community, often much smaller than other minority groups. And, you know, thinking about those people who become successful and become leaders, sometimes they have done that by pulling other deaf people down in order to achieve their own success. They have pulled down those around them, which really, you know, knocks the confidence of other deaf people. If deaf people have been pulled down, their confidence will be impacted by that experience. And then lots of deaf people might feel like, well, I don't want to apply to that job because of the way the deaf community might see me. I'll just stay in this same job. You know, I won't take the risks that come with working my way up the ladder and to success. So, you know, in my first job, I was fairly quiet. And then I realized, what am I being quiet for? I need to be loud. I need to show that deaf people can do this. I need to share this with the rest of the community. And, you know, we need to talk about this success, and we need to take other people on the journey with us. We need to give our experience to other people and take learnings from them. If we can have one person who's successful and they're able to lift 5 other people along the journey with them, and those 5 people take 5 more people, and those 5 people take 5 more people, there are plenty of jobs in the world for everybody to have an opportunity. It shouldn't be a competition. It should be about all of us helping raise each other up to increase that positivity and the opportunities for the whole community. Throughout my career, one of my favourite tips, you know, I've moved among a number of job roles, but probably the reason that I've been able to do that is because of 4 or 5 key people, you know, the decision makers who have given me those opportunities. So it's important to be able to identify who those 5 people might be for you. And whenever I join an organisation, I always look carefully around the organisation. And first of all, I make friends with IT. And the reason I make friends with people in IT is because in my everyday work, problems with technology are really big problems for me. So I can text somebody in IT if I have a great relationship with them, and they'll be on it and they'll solve my problems. They want to help me, and it can be really useful to have those people on your side ready to help you when you have issues. So they're almost my best friend, somebody in IT who I can talk to. I build that relationship with them, and then they're there to help me. And then just thinking about other people within the organisation, the cleaners can be really helpful. They always hear that work gossip that's going on. You know, those things that I miss out on because I'm deaf and I'm not necessarily hearing all of those conversations. And the cleaner might say, oh, do you know that this happened over there, or I saw this happen? And that information is really, really useful. It's useful to have that relationship with them. It's about really identifying the people throughout the organisation who can serve as your allies. You know, think about who's making the decision. Who are the senior people who are decision makers? Certainly when you're more junior within an organization, you might think, oh, I don't want to bother them because they're really senior. I don't feel comfortable approaching them. But actually, leaders love to see more junior people with ambition. They absolutely love it. So if you are more junior and you know, talk to that person, share your ideas with them, offer to help them, think about how they can help you. Think about, they're the people who are making decisions about jobs. And if you're at the forefront of their mind when an opportunity comes up, you may well be in the running for that opportunity. And think about that both inside and outside the organisation, because there are always opportunities outside where you're currently working as well. And that's linked to work, but then also just thinking about this slide here. I mean, throughout my career, sorry, it's just the previous slide. Thank you. Throughout my career, I have always been proud to be deaf. Of course I am. Being deaf is a wonderful thing. I don't aspire to be hearing. I'm very proud to be a deaf person. And whenever I've had problems at work, sometimes I've thought, I can sort them out. I don't want to ask for help. They'll think I'm stupid. I can do things and I'll do it myself. And actually, what often has happened throughout my career is that I have got worn out and stressed. I have been frustrated, and then I've been out of work where I've been worrying or stressed, or things have been really, really hard. And actually, asking for help isn't a weakness. So sometimes it's a shortcut that just makes your life easier. So remember the barrier I told you about, the interpreters, for when I was presenting that business plan to the board. If I were to go back, do you know what I would do? I mean, it's so simple. I would have said to the board, is it possible to move that meeting to a later date? I wouldn't have been seen as being weak. My interpreters would have been there and everything would have run smoothly the first time. It would have taken me 2 minutes to ask for a rescheduling of that meeting, rather than me spending hours trying to find interpreters and looking like a fool where they didn't understand the context. So sometimes asking for help is absolutely the right thing to do. And now in work, if I encounter a problem that I can't solve, I tell people what I need and I get them to help me. And people are more than happy to help, because usually they're looking to achieve the same thing as you. They don't judge you for asking for help. They're more than happy to help you. And I think that's really important, not to be too proud, but also to be confident enough to ask for help. And then just thinking about technology. Technology has changed so much over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, I was reliant on interpreters to be with me. We would travel on the train to meetings together across the country. I would be booking interpreters. It took a lot of my time. And over the years, there's been a real transition there because of the improvements in technology. So if I had to attend a really important meeting in New York, now, all I do is I book myself a flight. I don't have to think about whether an interpreter is available to come with me. I fly to New York. I turn my laptop up. I plug in the Ethernet, set my microphone up, and the interpreters there. I just ask the interpreters to work the later time zone to correspond with the US working times. And things are so different nowadays. But I think something that's important to remember is that it's useful for you to know about technology, but it's also useful to have interpreters who are comfortable with technology as well. Because if the interpreter's background's poor, or it's not running smoothly, or you can't hear them, or they can't hear other people who are talking, the meeting just won't run smoothly. So it's really important that you have interpreters who are great at using technology as well. So for example, I'm standing up presenting at the moment, and I have 3 screens in front of me with 3 different cameras on me. And one of them, I work in a number of different meetings. Sometimes I use Zoom and there might be 10 different people in that meeting, and then the interpreter's really tiny in the corner. So then I have half of the other screen where the interpreter's there. I can see them full screen. And then I have a 3rd screen for the presentation, so I can look among the people I'm in the meeting with and presentations and technologies. There's subtitles in meetings now as well. Because of coronavirus, I have been working at home for a long time, and I'm able to access everything I want to be able to access. Going back to the office actually doesn't provide me with any benefits, because technology has changed so much. And if you think about another 10 years in the future, that improvement will only continue. And then for the last slide, if I look back throughout the progression of my career, one thing in terms of ambition is about sometimes biting the bullet and moving out of your comfort zone, you know, taking that risk. You might be in a job that is perfectly comfortable, but another job might just offer you different learning opportunities and experiences, especially when you're young. Grab all of those opportunities to learn and all of those opportunities to take experience, and that will pay back later on. Sometimes you just have to take the risk. And actually, one thing that sticks in my mind, I think about 7 years ago, I was working at The Economist, and they asked me if I would travel to Switzerland to be filmed for a Swiss TV programme. And they wanted me to talk about how finance and the business could work together. It was nothing about deafness, it was about my financial career. And at first I thought, I really can't. I don't want to be filmed. I have to fly to Switzerland and back. I really hate being on TV. I don't really want everybody looking at me. But do you know what? I bit the bullet and I said yes. I flew to Switzerland and I was incredibly nervous, but I signed away, I completed the interview, and the interview went out on TV, and then I totally forgot about it until 5 years later, where a CEO of a different organisation watched that video. They watched my presentation and they were looking for a new CFO, a new Chief Financial Officer, and they thought, I've just watched Toby do that presentation. And they contacted me on the back of that interview and offered me a job. And if I hadn't have taken that step and bit the bullet and been brave, maybe that opportunity would never have arisen. And sometimes it's good to take risks, you know, calculated risks, but sometimes that's what you need to do to work your way up the ladder to success. So I know I've signed an awful lot now, so I'll stop my presentation now and welcome any questions. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'll hand back to Stuart. Thank you.
Wow. You know, I've got such a huge grin, and it's just got bigger and bigger through that wonderful presentation. So the audience have asked quite a few questions, really good questions. Just before we move on to those, I mean, the audience have been saying your presentation is amazing. It's just the perfect presentation, fantastic, brilliant. So it means you've offered so much thought-provoking experience sharing that people have been able to engage with about leadership, but also about your career and your life through that career.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do have some questions for you. Yeah, and also from our audience today as well.
Great.
One moment while I pick.
I'm happy to have hard questions, more than happy to have the tough ones.
Okay. So you've explained about the barriers and obstacles you've met along the way. How did you keep yourself motivated and manage your leadership journey in the world of employment? What maintained your motivation?
So for me, that journey itself was, you know, I could easily have left along the way. I could have taken an easy life if I'd wanted to, but I always felt as though every barrier that I encountered lit the fire more firmly within me. So when I was younger, I had some friends in Belgium who were, you know, similar to me, similar kind of level of ability and skill and things. And when I moved to England, some of those friends stayed in Belgium and continued their lives there. And later on, we had a school reunion. So I headed back to Belgium to meet all of my old friends and catch up with them. And there was a deaf guy there who was a professional gardener, really, really hot at designing gardens and gardening. And we had a chat. And he said to me that maybe 20 years prior, he had been approached by a manager who said, you know, you're the best of all of our gardeners. I want you to step up and be a team leader. And the deaf person thought, oh yeah, that's fine. And then he realized that that meant he had to manage meetings and communicate with people. And he thought, oh, that is hard work. Actually, I think I'll just stay in my job as a gardener and I'll continue where I am. And 20 years later, he still does exactly the same job at exactly the same level. And for me, that just seemed so frustrating, like such a waste of ability. He could have become the world's #1 gardener. I mean, he was amazing, and it was such a waste of skills and ability. You know, he just needed interpreters to help him along that journey, and just his story frustrated me. And I think, you know, I mentioned before about lifting others along the journey with you. If he had been successful, perhaps there might have been 10 people who would have watched him and thought, I could do that as well. And he could, I think leaders genuinely have a responsibility to take other people on the journey with them, like these sessions that you're currently running.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope people can take something home from that. So moving on to the next question. There's a lot of people that look at leaders and say, well, they've got a hearing aid, they can talk really well, that's why they've progressed. What about those who aren't able to make use of residual hearing or can speak? Can they still become leaders in the hearing world?
That's really interesting, because we talk about deaf people with sign language and no speech and no hearing, and whether they can become successful and successful leaders. And I think lots of people suspect that they can't. I think that there's almost a hidden hierarchy within the deaf community, or maybe a type of hidden competition, where you really have these two different pools of people. So one group of people who can speak really well or can make some use of their hearing, and you see them being successful. There are definitely people from that pool who are successful. Maybe we don't know them so well, but you know, they're speaking in their everyday work and using their hearing and being successful in that way. And then you also have people who are really great sign language users with amazing language but no speech. And lots of them tend to work as, you know, CEOs for deaf organizations. There are some who've set up their own very successful businesses with deaf services. But what about somebody who's deaf who wants to work in the hearing world, in a hearing organisation? That's definitely an area where, you know, I don't want to wear hearing aids or try to lip read people or try to speak in the hearing world. It's just not the way I was. I was born deaf, and I have always known that I can't speak. So whatever has been the point of me trying to lip read people, I have always been a sign language user. And I'm always very clear with the hearing people I work with that I need an interpreter. This is what I need to communicate. And actually that's made it easier for me. I have always been very clear about my communication needs. I think that perhaps people who can lip read a bit and use some useful hearing have maybe started their careers at a more junior level, where most of those meetings are one-to-one and they can lip read somebody one-to-one. But then when they move up into a more senior role or in big team meetings, it's much more difficult to use that level of hearing and lip reading. And then, you know, when you're very senior, you end up in phone calls with people with different accents and people who you can't lip read. And I imagine that becomes a much more difficult environment for people who are using their hearing. And at that level, those people might never have used an interpreter before, and then are going through a transition of their own and their own challenges. I almost feel like my journey has been easier because I have always used interpreters. I know very well how to use interpreters in the workplace. It doesn't matter to me how many phone calls I make or how many people are phoning me or how many people are speaking, because that's what I use interpreters for. And I almost think it's easier for a BSL using deaf person to use interpreters. Although I guess the caveat is that you have to have really hot, or maybe not hot, you have to have really good interpreters for you. And I think the key there is that a great interpreter isn't always a great interpreter for everybody. So they could be great for somebody, but they just might not fit your situation. You know, they might be great at the doctors, but not in business. And you have to really work to forge those relationships with the interpreters that you're using. And for me, that relationship is number one. It's so important. Having that relationship with your interpreters where you're flexible with each other, where you can have that give and take, that reciprocal relationship. So if I said to my interpreters, oh, I have a meeting with the CEO at 6 o'clock tonight where they're deciding on a structure, or 7 o'clock this evening, I would text one of my pool of interpreters and they would just be fine. They would be there to help me out. We have that really comfortable relationship, that really good relationship among us all. So I think building up relationships is not easy, and it makes time to build that pool of interpreters who really work for you, where you have that relationship of trust. But for me, that's really helped, you know, as a deaf person with no hearing aid and no access to hearing, to be successful.
Wow, there's a lot to think about in that answer. I know, and I've learned myself, you know, I remember how important it is to have that relationship with the interpreters you work with. Yeah, so completely agree with you on that one. Yeah, and I hope people are taking these tips on board and getting ideas on how they can move their careers forward with the advice you're giving. The next question is something we've heard from before in a different situation, but it can be related to work, and it's about promotion maybe. So when a deaf person applies for a job, you know, should they put on their application form that they're deaf, or do you keep that secret until you actually go for interview?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's been lots of discussion, lots of questions on that topic. And it's a topic that I've changed my mind on numerous times over the year as I've careered my way through my journey. So yesterday I had a presentation with a guy who was blind, and he was talking about how he applied for a number of jobs and was always rejected and never really got any feedback. And one company accountant fed back to him and said, I'm not recruiting you because you're blind, and I don't think you can become an accountant. They were very direct with him and said, that's why I'm not recruiting you. And, you know, the blind guy could have sued them for discrimination, but he said, thank you. He said, thank you for the feedback. That's the first time I have ever had that feedback. And so for the next interview he went to, he said, I'm blind, but I can do this and this and this and this. He spoke about all of the things he could do, and he got the job, and he became hugely successful in the area of accountancy, regardless of his visual impairment. And for me, I've almost never even thought about putting that I'm deaf on an application. It had never even crossed my mind that I should. So I remember when I worked at The Economist, I was in my job and there was a woman from Hong Kong who was quite senior. She was an events coordinator from Hong Kong. And I had had numerous emails with her over a period of time trying to reach a decision between us. And then she said, please, can you phone me? We need to discuss this urgently. So I picked up the phone and we made a phone call to her. And she said, no, I want to talk to Toby. And I said, that's me, I'm Toby. And she said, but I thought Toby was a man. And I realised that she could hear the interpreter. I explained, I have a female interpreter. And she said, why are you using an interpreter? Your English is fine. We've been emailing for months. And I said, no, they're a sign language interpreter. And her mind was completely blown. And then we were able to carry on the conversation. And it became almost a non-issue. You know, she had had no prior judgment. Perhaps if I told her I was deaf from the start, that might have been how she was approaching the meeting. I think sometimes you're working with people who might have met deaf people in their previous lives, and as no hearing person is the same, no deaf person is the same either, but they might then be coming to that encounter with you with a prior judgment or a prior assumption about who or what you are. And almost I don't give people time to process. I go into a business meeting and I talk to them about business. And then maybe later on in the evening, they might talk to their partner and say, oh, it was really interesting. I met somebody deaf, and that experience would have been more positive for them. I think in the UK and perhaps in the US, the Equalities Act means that you don't have to disclose that you're deaf unless you are asking for a reasonable adjustment, which of course would then involve you disclosing a disability. But apart from that, you don't have to disclose that you're deaf. So if you're going to an interview, I would bring an interpreter with me, and then I would enter my interview and engage with it the same as anybody else. That works better for me, and of course that's different for lots of other people. I mean, it's interesting to see how diversity has become more at the forefront of lots of organisations' minds and how it is increasingly important to them, which could mean that telling people that you're deaf could actually have a positive benefit. Maybe they're thinking about, you know, lots of other equality groups, but wanting to increase their diversity in a different way. There might be a benefit to saying you're deaf, and they might think, oh, that deaf person is going to bring some unique experience, and therefore we would like to employ them. But I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's something that the individual has to judge for themselves.
Yeah, it's still a personal decision, I guess, isn't it? Yeah,
Absolutely.
And I think you're right in that diversity and inclusion is higher on people's agenda now. So it might be seen as a positive point and something you want to show who you are to the company. So it might give you a better opportunity for interview. Right, so, you know, we talk about leadership, we talk about promoting leadership, and we're specifically talking about deaf leadership. But do you believe we should promote deaf leadership development, and how would we do that?
When I was the chair of RAD, it's an area that I thought about a lot, a question that I pondered often. So I was very keen that we were able to have deaf leaders. But when you looked back, really there was a very small pool of people who were in that position. And what was interesting is, you know, I consider myself kind of middle-aged. If you look at the deaf leaders, the people who have really made a difference and made a change, they all tend to be a bit older than me, kind of 50 plus. So there's quite a large pool who are that sort of age. And then in my generation or younger, there seems to be a real lack of people who are kind of at that CEO leadership level in their 20s and 30s, or maybe even 40s. There seems to be a bit of a gap. And when I've thought about it, I think it's because those 50 plus in about the 1980s had an event every year called FYD, which was the Friends for Young Deaf People. So it was a leadership program with presenters and motivational speakers. You know, it was talking about how you can become a leader, you need to be ambitious and aim for things. And that generation really benefited from that program. Then that program has stopped, and I can see a real gap from people who haven't had that same opportunity. You know, of course, the world has changed as well. More deaf people are going to mainstream schools. Deaf schools have closed. Deaf people probably have less confidence than maybe that group did who are attending deaf schools. But there's definitely a gap then in the next generation of people in deaf leadership. I mean, I think there's programs coming up here and there. But there's a group in Denmark which has an international attendance for people, really improving their confidence in the ability to become leaders. And in the UK, you know, Deaf and Hearing Trailblazers have a program to do much the same with courses for deaf leadership. I know that Deaf Unity and Abigas is really, you know, managing a program, and all of those are really fantastic programs, and I think we should see more of those. I think what's really important to me is exposure to deaf leaders, and remember that I said before about not pulling people down, but really encouraging people and supporting their success up the ladder. And, you know, by that success, we encourage further success within the community. When I was the chair of the board of RAD, there was a pot of money to be invested. And I thought a lot about investing that in a program like we're talking about, to encourage deaf apprenticeships or to give deaf people that opportunity to start their way up the ladder. You know, if you're able to invest money now, leadership isn't something that you can achieve overnight. You don't become a leader overnight. It's something that needs years and years of experience and problem solving and working your way around and through the challenges that you encounter. And, you know, I think that when those things are blocked early on in people's career, it makes it more difficult later on. But I think gaining those experience early on in your career really set you on the right path. I think there's a few more things out there now, and hopefully in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll start to see a larger pool again of deaf leaders appearing. And I think that as the deaf community, we should be working together rather than in competition to support that. You know, if organisations have money, it should absolutely be spent. There are plenty of deaf organisations throughout the UK who have got, if each of them put a little bit of money in, you know, it's difficult for each of them to make a big change in deaf leadership because, you know, there's not an awful lot of money. They can probably afford to benefit 1 or 2 deaf people, but if all of them pursed together, I feel as though they could make a really big impact and a really big change to the future of young deaf people, which I really hope will happen.
Definitely agree with you on that one. I think it is about pooling our resources more and working together. You know, we have skills, we have knowledge, we have experience within that. I mean, in Paul's last presentation, you know, that was key about that teamwork, that working together, that joint effort as we're moving forward. And it's all working towards the same goal as well.
Yes, definitely.
So you mentioned in your presentation about technology and how that's been useful, but how has access to work helped you in your career?
Oh, we are incredibly fortunate in the UK to have access to work. It's a unique system worldwide. I hope that people know what access to work is, but if not, it's a government fund or a government scheme for supporting communication, whether that might be interpreters or note takers in the workplace, to support people with disabilities. And we're the only scheme worldwide like that. You know, I've been given opportunities to move in my career to Switzerland, and when I've explored it, I've realised that there's no access to work. It's a barrier in itself. The same in the US. Really, we are fully supported in the UK. I'm lucky that that has been the case since the start of my career. However, access to work in more recent years has started tightening the purse strings, implementing caps on access to work budgets. And the people that affects is deaf people who are more senior in their career and who want to be leaders. That group are more seriously affected because it will be that group of people who need interpreters full time, who need interpreters every day that they're working. And if I used just the budget that Access to Work gave me, I could have interpreters 3 days a week, but for 2 days I couldn't. So what I've had to do is I had to approach my company and they pay for the additional 2 days. But they said, you know, I have to make a decision on who Toby is and how much he's worth. Is he worth 2 days extra salary? Because that's effectively what it is. And, you know, that makes me feel guilty. It makes me feel as though there is immediately pressure against me. So I have to do better than my hearing counterparts because I'm more expensive, because, you know, my company doesn't pay the same to recruit me as it does for hearing people. Luckily, we have an amazing interpreter called Darren Townsend Hanscom, who is both an incredible interpreter, but also a very active and adamant campaigner against access to work. So when the cap was implemented, he managed campaigns against them. He pulled deaf people together to really push back on that government decision to put a cap on the access to work budget. In fact, I attended a meeting with him where we met the Minister of Disability. And at the end of that meeting, while the cap wasn't lifted, it was increased. So it was more generous than it would have been originally. So not perfect, but it does at least mean that more deaf people should have the access they need to be successful. So if anybody ever meets Darren, I can't remember what his sign name is, Darren Townsend Hanscom, please, you know, give him a big hats off and a big thank you, because it's a gift that he has provided for all of us to become successful leaders, and something that he is has and continues to fight for. But for me, access to work is something that is incredibly precious and that we need to protect. In America, there is a law called ADA, which means that interpreters must be provided. But as always, companies have loopholes which they can use to get around that law. So they recruit deaf people, but they don't really provide interpreters in the way that we have here in the UK. And also there's a free video interpreting service in the US, which deaf people tend to use, which is all well and good. But for me, a free video service doesn't provide me with the interpreters who understand the area I work in or the jargon I use, or they don't have the right tone of voice that I want. They aren't able to match me. It will be a different interpreter every day who I don't know and they don't know me either. So we are incredibly lucky in the UK to have access to work. You know, it has in some senses limited my career. I don't think I could move to the US and work in the same fashion as I do here without access to work. But I'm hoping that with the increase in the focus on diversity and inclusion, that might improve in the future.
Thank you for that answer. We are running out of time, and there's so many questions that have been put. So if we send you the questions we haven't been able to ask, are you happy to reply to them?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, we will do that then. We'll work out how we do that and how we get the answers to people.
Absolutely. And just remember that if you have questions to ask, you know, they just provide you with more opportunities to learn about being a leader, lifting people on their way. You know, think about challenging yourself. Don't just accept the status quo. Challenge the barriers. Be positive about those challenges as well and lift those around you. So I'm more than happy to answer questions if people have them.
Thank you, Toby. I mean, the presentation, the answers to the questions, you've motivated us so much, and you know, you've made it thought-provoking for me, especially, you know, thinking, how am I going to move forward personally? What am I going to do to move forward? So just a huge thank you for coming, joining us today in this seminar. You've really hit the nail on the head of what we wanted to achieve. And I really appreciate the inspiration you've given to all those that have joined today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable.
And I hope we can work together in the future to to keep these summits going.
Absolutely. And I hope to see more of this. I mean, there's plenty of inspiring deaf leaders. I know that you have a course of these events still to come, and I'm really keen to see more of this kind of encouragement and motivation around the community.
Yes, definitely. It's pulling people up, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. Thank you. So I'm sorry, everybody, we are out of time today. We are going to have to draw the session to a close, but don't all hit the leave button straight away. Please stay and just find out what's happening next.
Thank you.